from the community? What might encourage them to arrive? Why do you think they would come?
They might be taken from their community and killed here.
That's a possibility, absolutely.
That they don't want you to take any artifacts? Or
That could be, it could be.
To bear witness.
To bear witness, and if they're also indigenous people in a country that suffered massive violations of human rights and they're from another nearby village, might they have a reason? What do you think it might be? They come because they want us to know what happened where they live, in their community.
We would hope you go there next.
Exactly, exactly. And so these women would come every day and sit there silently watching, and they'd get closer and closer, and then sooner or later they come up to you and say, you know, we had a massacre too. And this happened at every single place we did the exhumations, and because this is before the Truth Commission or the Catholic Church's Nunca Más project, the lists of massacres were coming from the information that we were collecting while doing exhumations. So if you look at the Human Rights Ombudsman report for 1994, it looks like most massacres happened in Baja Verde Paz, where Rabinal is located. But that's only because all these people from Baja Verde Paz were coming to where we were to tell us about massacres in their community. And we'd say, well, how many people died? And they would always say the same thing, casi todos, nearly everyone. And sometimes they meant all the men, and sometimes they meant all the women, and sometimes they meant almost everyone. Very few people survived. So that was exactly what they came for. And in this particular case, there were 18 graves there. So you can see this is Plante Sanchez, grave 2, skeleton or skeletal area 13, because these skeletons are all mixed up because those people were burned. And so all the bones got mixed up in the process of the fire. And that's me many moons ago working with Fernando Moscoso on that particular grave. And we're basically having to count every bone because it's the only way we can make an estimate about how many people were in that grave. Is by separating them by category and counting them. And then here again, you can see the women getting closer and watching where Mariana's working so that they can tell us what happened where they were. And then we catalog all of the skeletons that we find. Sometimes they're complete, sometimes they're overgrown with roots. That's not blood, that's actually roots that had grown because it was on top of a natural water spring. So we had to cut through all the roots to pull up all the bones because the roots had actually grown through the bones. And this is a photo that's, I think, really interesting and also representative of genocide. Do you notice something missing in the composition of that group, that family?
Parents.
Well, actually, these are the parents of these kids. Yeah, they just look really old, but they're not that old. That woman's probably in her mid-30s, and he's probably in his early 40s, but they've had a really, really difficult life. And this woman is probably in her mid to late 50s. But there aren't any teenagers, right? Because this is in 1994. So the massacre in this area happened in 1982. So if you were a baby or a small child, that would make you a teenager. But babies and small children didn't survive, right? Because you don't survive life in flight if you're a baby or a small child because you don't have access to vaccines, because there isn't food, because mother's milk dries up, for a whole host, because of exposure to the elements. Children don't do well in life in flight. And so in lots of communities, these were the age groups. There's a breakdown, there's a missing generation. And this family had come. They actually were the only survivors in their community. And this young man, he did survive. He was 15 years old in 1994, but he contracted polio because there weren't polio vaccines in the mountains. So I always point that out because we all get asked for money all the time in the mail, and in emails, you get emails all the time asking you to contribute something. But when you get one for Oxfam asking you to give something, it's my plug for Oxfam, they always provide vaccinations to refugees. So if you're trying to decide where to give your $5, $10, $100, whatever you have, that's a good spot to help children survive. In this particular image, we're actually letting them sort through artifacts that we found because they're helping to try to do presumptive IDs, which is to say, I recognize this belonged to my loved one. This was before the forensic team had access to DNA, and to do DNA analysis, there was a professor at the University of Washington who was working as a volunteer helping us out, but wasn't able to do massive quantities of DNA analysis. Today, the Forensic Foundation is the only place in Guatemala that does DNA analysis. And then here you can see the artifacts on the ground and people looking at them and trying to sort through. And here we're sifting through the dirt because we go a foot deeper than the last artifact was found and sift the dirt. What do you think we might be looking for in the dirt? Any guesses? Well, if there are bullets, and if bullets go into a person and the person is left in a grave for 12 years, the bullets are going to oxidize and the weight is going to push them down. So we want to find bullets. So we're really specifically looking for metal that might have fallen further into the earth as time went by. What might bullets tell us if we find them? What could bullets help us identify?
What kind of gun?
What kind of gun, right? And what kind of gun helps us identify who shot, right? Because we know what kind of guns the Army carried, right? And we know what kind of guns the guerrilla carried. And this image is just to show you what it looks like when you're on the side of the hill doing an exhumation, and that's what you do all day long, because it takes like 6 to 7 hours to excavate one skeleton. So you find all kinds of really uncomfortable ways to stand. And every bone is cataloged, and observations are made about any kinds of injuries we notice while we're doing the actual excavation. And here is an oxidized bullet, so there's an arrow pointing it out. And this information goes back to the lab because it helps in the lab analysis as well, because they'll get the materials boxed. So this is Planty Sanchez, grade 8, skeleton number 1, grade 8, skeleton number 7. And then inside all the skeletal matter and artifacts are bagged and marked as well. So they'll get the sheets that provide information about what the status of the skeletal matter was. Because when you look at the skeleton in the grave, you might think, well, that looks like that person got hit with a machete there, or that looks like this person got hit here in the head. So that helps them in the lab when they're doing their analysis as well. And this unfortunately got cut off, but that's an X-ray machine in Guatemala, and we're X-raying a cranium that had come apart. And what you can see in the X-ray are bullet fragments or grenade fragments, which you can't see with the naked eye. So that's important for us for helping to understand and do the reconstruction. And this is actually the exit one. This woman was shot in the head. And that was actually the first cranium that I excavated. So when I picked it up and the dirt fell out, it fell apart in my hands. And so I thought I had broken it, but I hadn't. It was because the bullet had gone through. And this is what it looks like at the end of the excavation of the grave. And everything is marked and creates a forensic record. So in victim identification, you could do the presumptive ID, which is the people looking at the material, and you can do fingerprinting, but obviously you can't do fingerprinting of skeletons. You can do an ontological matching of dental records, but of course peasants really don't have dental records. You can do bone identification if there are medical records or x-rays that document trauma, or you can do DNA. And so most of these, the dental and medical records for indigenous peasants, those don't really exist. But if someone broke a leg when they were 9 years old, they're going to have a scar on that bone where that happened. And if someone had some kind of dental work done in their mouth, teeth pulled out, which is mostly what the dental work is for indigenous people, or some sort of pseudo gold tooth put in, then there'll be the family member will recall that, but that still kind of falls into presumptive ID. This is the reburial of the victims of the massacre in Planty Sanchez in October of 1994, and that's the first time that the massacre was publicly discussed in Rabinal. And it's a really important moment for the history of that community. And Benjamin's brother, Juan Manuel Jerónimo, spoke in front of his community, and he talked about what had happened in the massacre and how his wife had been killed and his children had been killed, and that the army had said they were all guerrillas and subversives. And he said, how can my baby be a guerrilla? It's a shame on the army for doing this. What a terrible shame that this happened here. It's shameful. And he told me afterwards, he said, you know, I knew when I was speaking, I was nervous to speak publicly because Spanish is his second language. He became literate and learned Spanish as a 24-year-old adult. And he said, I knew that I might be someone who can't really speak that well, but I wanted to stand up there and speak the truth. And when I started to speak the truth, I was no longer afraid. And I looked around and I said, and those of you in Rabinal who helped the army, shame on you too. Shame on you for not helping us. Now this is the truth, and this is what we've lived through. And he told me that afterwards, that a man in the town, a Ladino, a non-Maya, came up to him and said, oh, if you were a licenciado, and licenciado in the rural towns is a term that's loosely used to refer to people who have a bachelor's degree, but oftentimes they don't really have bachelor's degrees, they just claim to be licenciados. And so the licenciado in Rabinal came up to him and said, oh, Juan Manuel, if you had a licenciado, then maybe there would be real change here. And Juan Manuel said to me, you know, I might only be able to half speak, but I did speak the truth. And I did it before my community. And the really interesting thing, and these caskets are really heavy because they're hand-planed cypress, so it's really heavy, dense wood. And we offered to get vehicles to take the caskets up for the reburial. It's a 3.5-hour walk up the mountain to where they were going to be reburied in Plan de Sanchez. And the people in the community said, no, no, we're going to walk all through the streets of Rabinal and all the way up the mountain, because there are people who denied that this happened, and this is our evidence, this is our truth. And so they spent the day taking the caskets around. So part of the process of the exhumation as well is participating in the truth-telling with the community members. And then another way that we can do documentation is through archival research. And some of it's pretty obvious and some of it ends up being less so. So the first is looking at government decrees, municipal archives, declassified documents, leaked documents, police and ward records. So this is a government decree from when Rios Montt came to power on the 25th of March in 1982. And he declares, or he came to power on the 24th, on the 25th he declares that the military junta basically has made illegal and annulled the Congress, the Supreme Court, and all democratic institutions in the country, which weren't that democratic to begin with, but he has just named himself head of the military junta. And so this document, one of the things it does is it reaffirms the power of Rios Montt, that he was able to do that on March 25th, 1982. Another is to look at declassified documents. And if you want to look at declassified documents, you can go to the National Security Archive. You can put in most any country in Latin America and some other countries in other parts of the world, and you will find documents that the National Security Archive, which is a non-governmental organization, has amassed to help in transparency. And they supported the Truth Commission in putting some 50,000 declassified documents up about Guatemala. And one of the things about declassified documents is you have to learn to read them. And it's straightforward, but not straightforward, because here it'll say this is from the American Embassy in Guatemala to the Secretary of State in Washington. And then you'll see that copies also went to the embassies in Tegucigalpa, Managua, San Jose, Belize, Mexico, Panama, the American Embassy in London. But here, it's gone to different military missions and intelligence agencies. So this same document is declassified by the State Department, but it's also going to be declassified by those agencies. And those different declassified documents are going to be in the National Security Archive. Now, the people who redact documents, who mark out things that they don't think we should see, they don't all have the same idea of what should be redacted. So sometimes it's really useful to get copies of the different declassified documents, the same document from different agencies, because you can put together more information about what different agencies knew and what was important to them as well. So this is a document, when I testified in 2012 at before Judge Pedras in Madrid, there's an international genocide case against the Guatemalan generals. And so I was asked to speak about whether there was a genocide in Guatemala, but also about command responsibility of General Efrain Rios Montt. And so I went through all of these declassified documents, and I was really interested when I found this one, because it talks about a Maryknoll superior, Father Bill Mullen, who went to the embassy to denounce massacres. And as I read it, I thought, it's kind of interesting because they're sort of making it sound like he thought things were getting better, which I just couldn't imagine he really thought while he went there to denounce some 23 massacres. So I thought, well, Bill Mullen, I wonder if he's still around and where he might be. And so I Googled him, and I found that he had spoken at a little Catholic college in the Midwest, and I emailed the professor at that college, and I said, I'm trying to get in touch with Father Bill Mullen, and he just serendipitously happened to be in Maryknoll, New York, and he met me in Manhattan. He had never seen this document. He was very upset about the way he was portrayed in the document, but he provided me with really interesting information about experiences that priests had had during that period that showed command responsibility. I'll come to that in just a minute. And then this is a leaked document, and it's a really important document that was leaked by a military officer in Guatemala. We're not certain who it was that leaked it, but it's number 6 of 20 copies. And this is called Operación Sofía, and it was the Guatemalan Army's plan for the genocide in the Ixchel area in 1982. And it shows all kinds of acronyms. So it'll say official S1 is going to be Joel, Comandante Base de Patrulla Palma, Capitan Cohete. These are all made up aliases, right? So everybody's been given an alias. And so we can go back and look and see who had these positions. Not all of them are publicly available, but we can kind of piece it together and then figure out which acronyms go or which pseudonyms go with each name. And that helps us as we read through the document and see that a commander made a command, because they list the command that came out in this document that says, for example, kill all the cockroaches, don't leave any chocolates. And if you look in their glossary, cockroaches are Ixchel peasants and chocolates are children. So the order that they've given is to kill the adults and don't leave any chocolates alive either. It's like eliminate all of them. And so this has been a really explosive document in Guatemala and implicated Otto Pérez Molina, who was recently kind of deposed in a democratic process, which we can also talk about at the end. And then in a country like Guatemala, in many post-conflict spaces, you have a lot of post-conflict violence. So one of the things we also look at are deficiencies in the way that contemporary cases are treated. And this is the case of Claudina Isabel Velázquez Páez. It's an emblematic case of feminicide in Guatemala. And we did an analysis of deficiencies in her murder investigation by going through all the files that were there, and also having forensic experts go through and look at the way that the forensic aspect of her case had been handled. And I saw Wolf looking at his watch, so how much time do I have? Oh, okay. All right. So I wasn't sure. It was like overtime already. Okay. Okay. All right. So then we also have archival research, right? And when you do archival research, you can do journalistic accounts, you can look for television footage, and because I was testifying in Spain, I felt really committed to getting in touch with anybody who had been in Guatemala in 1982 during the massacre. And so I wrote to everyone I knew, and Sally Stein, who's sitting here, being one of them who has helped at different points on cases in Guatemala. I wrote to a lot of people from the New York Times, from the New Yorker, who had been in Guatemala. And the thing that was really interesting is people would say, oh, you can't write to John Lee Anderson. He doesn't write back to anybody. He wrote back to me the next day and said, I'm in Syria, call me in London in 2 weeks, and I'll see what I can find in my archives. And because people who were there in 1982 during the genocide were marked by the experience. Because they were young people, it was their first journalistic experience, and they went there, and it was hard for them to even find the words to express what they witnessed. And so they had really interesting information they wanted to share. And so did Elizabeth Farnsworth from Public Television. She sent me DVDs of the footage that they took up in the mountains to try to assist us. So you want to reach out to everybody you possibly can. And then also look in archives of newspapers in the country where you're working. So this is the story of Marvin Perez and his sisters and some of his friends, who in June of 1982 were all minors. Marvin was 14, and they were disappeared. There were 11 children who were disappeared by the state. And I know Marvin's story from Marvin, who survived. And so it's a unique story because most of the 50,000 people who were disappeared in Guatemala did not survive, nor did the 5,000 children. And Marvin was from a poor family in Guatemala City. His father was a shoemaker. his mother decided to come. They decided the mother would come to Los Angeles and work as a domestic and send money home to pay for school supplies so that Marvin and his two sisters could go to public school, because you have to pay for everything in public school in Guatemala. And so the father called the mother and said, "Our children are gone. They've disappeared." And so the mother contacted El Rescate here in Los Angeles that had helped her with her asylum claim, and El Rescate contacted Amnesty International, so this case of these children became an international human rights case. And so that's why Marvin's alive, otherwise he would have disappeared like the other 5,000 children did. And so his story, what happens to them is, here you have, it says 8 children are disappeared. There are 3 others that, and it says 3 of them are brothers and sisters, but there were other children beyond these 8 who were disappeared. But these are newspaper stories that start to show up, and they tell the official story, because what happened to these kids is they got picked up on the street by the police, they were taken to a police station, they were beaten and tortured in the police station. Army soldiers, officials came with photo albums showing them pictures of other kids from their school. They were threatened, they were tortured quite brutally and scientifically by these military people still in the police station. Then civilian men came who were very rough and not in uniforms, and were thrown in with them, and they threatened them in the middle of the night, and they said, "We'll be back for you." And then the next morning, the police woke them up and dragged them out, wrapped their heads in newspaper and masking tape, and passed them to these men who took them to a clandestine jail, which was a place where they were for 2 weeks. They would have died in that place in those 2 weeks if the mother hadn't gone to El Rescate and Amnesty International hadn't been working. And so we know Marvin's story because he survived. He's one of 8 children who survived. 3 children didn't survive. But the newspaper story is so interesting because there's like this parallel universe that you see in the way it's presented in the newspaper. The government's really worried about the disappearance of the kids. This is while they're still at the police station, right? The Minister of Education and Public Relations is really concerned about the disappeared students. And this is under Rios-Montt also, right? And it says the government has advised the police to look for the students. This is at about the time that they're being passed off, right? And then they said, well, could they have been kidnapped by the guerrillas? Because that's always what you say in a military dictatorship, right? That it's subversives, that it's guerrillas, that it's not the government. And then there's like, well, we're still looking, we're trying to localize the disappeared students. And then Rios-Montt issues an amnesty decree. And in the amnesty decree, he says that the military will, give you amnesty if you step forward, right? And that your country wants you, your family needs you back. And then Rios-Montt says, he who does not surrender will be executed. So this is a great article because it shows command responsibility, right? That he'll even say that publicly. If you don't give yourself up, we'll execute you if you don't surrender. And then suddenly, after this happens, the detained students are taken to the tribunal for minors. So they went to the police, are worried, we're looking for them, maybe the guerrilla kidnapped them, these students were detained and they've gone to the tribunal for minors, and they're in guerrilla cells, of course. And the families will be called and informed about their children's activities. Marvin told me that some of the kids weren't picked up, probably because their parents were afraid. They were afraid that if they went to pick them up, that the other kids in their family would be marked. And so he doesn't know what happened to all of those kids. And then the government says, well, we've given up the students to their families, and the students, when they're turned over to their families, they were forced to give a confession for their release. And Marvin said that one day, from being in torture chambers and being rotated through awful experiences that I won't go into in detail because they're too upsetting, that these men came in and said, okay, we're going, and took them to a clean place, had them shower, gave them clean clothes, and kind of cleaned them up for a couple days, and then said, sign these confessions, and then you can go. You have to speak publicly. And that was the condition for them being released. And then, of course, the subsecretary of Public Relations for the president says, the government treated them very well during detention, right? And so that's the conclusion of that story. But so these documents, they actually show a parallel universe that also verifies the story that Marvin has told us about what happened to him. And since the police archive in Guatemala was discovered, he's been able to do research there, finding out who the different officers were who were in charge at the time that this happened. And in terms of command responsibility, what's stunning about his case is that you can see the chain of command under Rios-Montt, the national police on the street, police intelligence at the local station, intelligence officials from the army, death squad in the local station, death squad at clandestine jail, but then they regurgitate them back through the system, which shows the command responsibility existed, that those people are under someone's control. It's not rogue violence, because that's what people in charge always want you to think. After terrible violence has been committed, that they're rogue officers, that somehow they're these people like spontaneously doing the same thing in all parts of the country, and they're really bad things, but they weren't trained to do that and they weren't given orders, it just happened because they were rogue officers. The other thing that you can do to document human rights violations in genocide is to look back at reports that have been created and think about different ways you might move the organization around, the organization of information. That's what we were talking about earlier about the archive at the Truth Commission report, or governmental, non-governmental organizations. So with some of my students, we went through the 626 massacres that were committed in Guatemala, and we looked at who committed it, when it was committed, was it the Army and the Civil Patrol, and during whose regime it was. So we reorganized the presentation of information, and what we were able to see is that in northern Quiché, if we look at the last 12 months of Lucas Garcia, who was the dictator before he was elected, but he was still a military dictator, he was in charge before Rios-Montt came to power through a coup. It looks like the number of victims was higher under Lucas Garcia, but in the first 3 months of Rios-Montt, it was higher than the last 3 months of Lucas Garcia. So, so looking at the information, it's like, well, what exactly does that mean? So what if we look at it in another way? So we start looking at the total number of massacres, and then, because Rios-Montt said, I'm not doing any more massacres, right? But we can see he's still clearly killing people. And then here, it's like, well, so he committed 32 massacres, which is less than 45. It's still an awful lot, right? In the last 3 months of Lucas Garcia, 24. First 3 months of Rios-Montt, 19. But when we start looking at the number of victims per massacre, what we see is the number of victims per massacre has gone up. So in the first 3 months of Rios-Montt, it's over 55, where in the last 3 months of Lucas Garcia, it was 3. And so suddenly, there's some things that start to make sense. Massacre survivors from the same village, some of them would say the massacre was in 1981. And then others would say the massacre was in 1982. And so some people would say, oh, you know, these indigenous people, they don't like have a calendar. They don't know the years, they don't know when things happen. Well, actually, it turns out that there were 2 massacres. In 1981, there was a selective massacre under Lucas Garcia. And so under Lucas Garcia, the army came in and they selectively killed all the men. They took all the young men, like 15 up to 45, and they killed them and then they left. But under Rios-Montt, the soldiers came back to the same village and they killed everyone. And so that's how you end up with these numbers, and how you end up with people from the same village giving you what seems like a different story, but they've lived through the same trauma. So if you start talking to them about when the violence began and when everyone left the village, you find out actually there were 2 massacres there. And so at the end of the day, when we look at the total number of victims for all of Quiché, we're not so surprised to see that more people died in the first 12 months of Rios-Montt than in the last 12 months of Lucas Garcia. So that's a lot of people. Just in one area of Guatemala, more than 3,000 people were killed under Rios-Montt. And the year before that, 2,500 had been killed. So really shocking. The other thing that we find is that if we look at how massacres were committed, under Lucas Garcia, 81% were committed by the army, 87% under Rios-Montt, and with the PAC, which were the civil patrols, under Lucas Garcia, it's 19, under Rios-Montt, it's 13. Or, I'm sorry, that's all in the number, I'm sorry, I mixed up my numbers here. This is the percentage of massacres, and this is the percentage of victims. So under Lucas Garcia, this is all under Lucas Garcia, because I put it in Spanish instead of English, sorry. Under Lucas Garcia, almost 90% of the massacres are committed by the army, And there is some participation of the PAC, which are the local civil patrols. All young men, old men, any male over 12 or 13 was forced to participate in civil patrols. And so under Lucas Garcia, there were some of those civil patrols participating in the massacres. This is how Rios Montt was able to kill so many people, is that almost 50% of massacres that were committed, both massacres and victims, it happened with the army working with the PAC. So they were forcing local people to participate in the killings, which further destroyed the local community. So if you have a rural municipality with a lot of villages, like in Rabinal, the Civil Patrol in Chocó participated in the massacre in Rio Negro. And so in 10 years later, 12 years later, when I was in Rabinal, and I saw little boys who were 9 and 10 years old, they were fighting in the street, and the insult that they were throwing at each other was, "Vos sos de Chocó." You're from Chocó. That was the insult for anyone who wasn't from Chocó. And I went with a community healing project to different villages around Rabinal, and they would ask people, they would show an image of an individual in Achi clothing, and the person looked really sad and kind of crumpled into themselves, and they would ask the people, the men in a men's group or women in a women's group, why does that person feel so sad? And so all of the villages that weren't Chocó, the people would say, oh, she feels so sad because she swallowed her heart into her stomach because she's had so much sorrow. Oh, he feels so sad. His head hurts. It's heavy with pain from all the suffering, right? So they're metaphors for emotional suffering that people have had for the trauma that they've gone through. And when we went to Chocó and did it with the people there, they said, brujeria, witchcraft, because all the other villages were burning black and red candles against the people of Chocó. Right? And so the army very effectively divided people in rural communities as well by using those civil patrols, which meant that after the violence, they could call on those people when they needed to. Those structures still exist. They're not completely disentangled or dismantled. The other thing that we did is looked at the composition of the victims. So the red is women and the blue is men. And we can see that under Rios Montt, the number of women, the percentage of women being killed goes up. And this right here, it began actually in June of 1980, or July of 1982, when the percentage of women victims was really high. And if we look at genocide, one of the things that marks genocide is the destruction of the reproductive capacity of the community. And so when you start to see more women being killed in communities, it's directly targeting, destroying the ability of that community to reproduce, which is the beginning of the genocide, no doubt. Then we also, in contemporary cases, we look at the number of homicides per year. And so this is up to 2008. Sadly, it's not less now, it's more today than it was then. It was 370 a year in 2008. Today in Guatemala, 2 women are killed every day, which is one of the highest rates in the world. We look at male homicides, and we can see that they're astronomically high as well. And then we look at and compare these stats to other places in the world to try to understand the context. Well, is that unusual? Are there higher rates? And these stats were done a few years ago. So today, actually, Colombia is lower than Guatemala. And Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are in competition for the highest homicide rate in the world. In fact, Northern Central America has the highest homicide rate in the world, which is pretty stunning. And I presented this once actually in Japan, which has less than 1/2 of 1 person per 100,000 killed a year, as opposed to the United States, where we have, I think it's actually 7 a year now, not 5.62. And I had a translator who was translating it to Japanese. And so when I was talking about these numbers, the professors stopped the translator and they were saying, no, you've made a mistake, right? Because they couldn't fathom that the numbers could possibly be that high. But of course, these countries that have really low numbers, it's because they have gun control, right? Unlike our country. And then male homicides, these are really interesting and important statistics to look at, because this spike right here, if we look at the number, it's over 7,000 a year. That's in 1982. That's the height of the genocide. And then it starts to drop down in 84, 85, and then it starts, there's a spike. This is when the peace accords are signed, and that's not unusual in times when peace accords are being negotiated. People start to eliminate their enemies or show that they have power, whatever it may be. And then this is normal, that it goes down, but then it goes way up here, 2000 and on up to today. And in the case of the number of women being killed, today the number of women being killed has eclipsed the number of women being killed at the height of the genocide in Guatemala, which is why Central America and Guatemala are in such crisis, that people live in such high levels of insecurity. And so this data is from World Health Organization and National Police data. And I work with a statistician who has a formula that's used that evens everything out. They do comparative data to come up with numbers that somehow holistically represent what it would really be, because the problem with doing this kind of data analysis is that you're collecting numbers from people you don't trust when you're collecting numbers from the police department, right? Because the police department, if you get killed here, they'll count that as a homicide, but if you die in the hospital 2 weeks later, they don't, for some reason. Right? And so you have to look at more data, you have to look at police data and move it on through. The other thing that we tried to do in looking at contemporary homicides is look at it by department. This was with the Human Rights Ombudsman's Office in 2005. So we were trying to figure out like which departments have the highest homicide rate and to try to see if there's some kind of correlation that we can make to past experiences. And one of the things that was really interesting for us here is that in Baja Verde Paz, they had one of the lowest rates. And of course, we think that the reason they had the lowest rate is because they've had so much local community organizing for human rights, because it's one of the first communities where exhumations took place. And people began local human rights organizations, and a local human rights activist from Rio Negro, Jesus Tech, he was awarded a Reebok Award for human rights. And it was like $50,000. With that $50,000, he started a community human rights organization that's still working today, 20 years later. And so we think that has a lot to do. Community structure has a lot to do with what happens at the local level. And then lastly, in the ongoing collection of evidence, we have testimonies, interviews, photos, and documents. So I took these testimonies in 1997, and I have my claves, my little system for knowing who they are, because I was really careful to make sure that whenever I had with me, if anyone got it, they wouldn't be able to identify who they belong to. But now, 1997, now it's 2015, I want to know who these people are when I'm looking at the transcripts or listening to the testimonies again, because I'm going to publish another book in Guatemala about the East Shield Genocide, and I'm using these testimonies. So it's really important that you make some kind of map and that you keep it so that you can make sense of all the tapes you have, because 20 years later you're going to end up with a lot more material. So some kind of cataloging system. I'm really glad our professional indexer is gone, because he'd probably be horrified with how I kept my information, but I am still able to find it because it's just my little tiny universe. No one else has to know how to go into it. And then this is an excerpt from a testimony, and what's really powerful about this testimony is I had a translator in the East Shield area for a couple of years, and we were very good friends, and she took me into communities I wouldn't have had access to because her family were massacre survivors. And in this particular story, the woman is talking about how they were in flight and how her baby died, and the woman, when she's translating it to me, it's her sister who's actually telling the story, and she says to me in Spanish, because her sister doesn't speak Spanish, she says, "I never knew that until now." And it's a story about how the baby died from hunger up in the mountains. And then another is looking at newspaper articles, and this was one of John Lee Anderson, and finding articles that he had written and getting in touch with him, and then doing an interview with him. And he told me an amazing story, which was he was working for Jack Anderson, no relative. Jack Anderson had a television program, and John Lee Anderson was kind of a stringer for him. And there was someone at the Jack Anderson news program who had a contact at the embassy who was this super shady guy, whose name was Warble, who was an Office of Strategic Services intelligence guy. So John Lee Anderson goes and meets with this guy Warble. Warble introduces him to Rios Montt, and Rios Montt gives him a letter. And the letter that he has, it's a letter, in Guatemala they call it un aval. It's like a letter that says, Rios Montt supports this person, right? It's signed by the president. And so John Lee Anderson told me that he went onto military bases with that document. He went past civil patrol checkpoints. He said some of the places they would pick it up and not, weren't able to read it, but they'd see the presidential seal on it. But most significantly, he told me that one night they were coming back, wherever they had been in Huehuetenango, they felt that it was so incredibly insecure that it was safer to drive back to Guatemala City. This is in the fall of 1982, at the height of the genocide. And as they're driving back, they get pulled off the road by a big white four-wheel drive vehicle. And he described these very burly guys coming out in civilian clothes holding Uzis. And he told me that he looked at his photographer and he said, "Nos van a asesinar, they're going to kill us," right? And he said he held up that letter to the window, and these guys looked at the letter and said, "These roads are dangerous at night. You should really get back to Guatemala City," and let them go. And so that letter becomes also part of the tale of command responsibility, right? That so Rios Montt, when he says in court or in the public news, like, "I didn't know, no one told me, I wasn't really in charge," we have a lot of different kinds of documentation that shows, in fact, he did have command responsibility. And then random things happen. I took this photo in December of 1996 up in Quiche because, it's so militarized that Santa wears camouflage. Right? And so even to just get a flavor, right? I mean, it's kind of outrageous. And then this is like the great moment, the Panzos in Alta Verapaz in Guatemala, when I was invited by the teachers to present my book. And when we went there I am, sweating and melting, because it's really, really, really hot and humid, and it's in a cinder block building with an aluminum roof, and it's probably about 107 degrees with 120% humidity. So it's like super drippy. And this is Maria Maquin, my hero, this amazingly brave woman. And the thing is, for full disclosure, after I accepted the invitation of the teachers to go down there, then they said, "Oh, by the way, we wanted to ask you a favor. Do you think you could get someone from the Human Rights Ombudsman's office to come with you?" And I actually had some security concerns anyway, and I had emailed basically all my friends saying, "You want to go for a really interesting weekend to Guatemala? We'll be leaving on Wednesday, you'll be home on Sunday," right? And so kind of, your friends who have little disposable income, don't have kids, or a little bit adventurous, or just really love you, those are the people who will go. And so we had an assortment of 28 internationals, 5 vehicles, and we all went to Panzos. It didn't end up being 5 days for them because, unfortunately, that was when the volcano decided to erupt, and it closed the airport for 2 weeks. So the only friend of mine who got out was a journalist, because as soon as that volcano erupted, he was on a bus to El Salvador so he could get a flight home. Everybody else had to hang around. But in any case, when we went there, Maria Maquin and her friends, the teachers, wrote to me and they said, "Well, we really want you to bring the Human Rights Ombudsman or someone from his office because we have a petition that we want to present. And if you invite them to come for the book presentation and tell them that we want to talk with them, they'll probably come with you." And so I said, "Okay, well, I'll tell them that you're presenting a petition so that they're not blindsided, so they know, that they're coming for other reasons as well." And so we did the book presentation, and Maria Maquin was speaking, and it was really quite powerful because my book, it ends with testimony that she gave when we were doing the reburial. And I had spoken about her testimony, and a poet from Guatemala City had spoken about her testimony, and a journalist from Guatemala City had spoken about her testimony. And I sat there as an anthropologist thinking about all the things that we're taught about appropriating words of others and what that means when you deploy them and how you use it. And I was thinking, I wonder how she feels, because she doesn't speak Spanish, I wonder how she feels listening to her words being translated back to Quechua in all of our different interpretations. I wonder what she's thinking. And she stands up and she says, now you know, because they have repeated my words, that what I say is true. This is what happened here. So, you know, sometimes you can validate people's words in the process. And I'm not making light of the possibilities of appropriation or misuse of the words of others. But if you're working with people and supporting communities, and I like to think that at our very best as anthropologists, what we're doing is accompanying communities, and that we accompany them at the invitation. We're not forcing any work upon them. I've only ever been places where I've been invited to be. But so what she wanted to talk about, and the petition was against the army. They were asking the Human Rights Ombudsman to deliver a petition to the president because the army wanted to build a military base in their town. And this was a town that had suffered a terrible massacre. And so these are signatures. The letter, these are the kind of signatures you have if you're not literate and unable to write your hand or write your name. At the end, there were like 560 something signatures like that on a document, and the Human Rights Ombudsman did come. The deputy ombudsman came, and she was absolutely wonderful. And she received the petition, and she took it back to Guatemala City and presented it to the president. And the battle over the space continues in Guatemala. But so part of what happens as well when you do the work for long enough is not only am I documenting human rights abuses and genocide, but you become part of the process. And so you want to make sure that you know the communities where you're working quite well when you're doing that. But it was really my honor to assist this community that had already suffered so much violence previously. And then this is just sort of an aside, but I added this on because this is Otto Perez Molina on September 7th when he found out that he was going to jail. And he's a genocidaire. He's a general. He was the commander of the army base in Neiba at the height of the genocide in 1982. He later became general, and then he became president. And he's in preventive detention today on corruption charges and likely will go to jail. This is a case that was developed by the UN Commission Against Impunity. It implicated Otto Perez Molina, his vice president, Roxana Valdetti, and her personal secretary. And it appears, I don't know what the actual numbers are because they haven't been released, but it looks like they probably took 40% of what should have been import tax revenue into their own personal pockets. And I think one of the things that's interesting, a lot of people have asked me, well, don't you feel bad that he's in jail for corruption and not genocide? And I think I'm just glad he's in jail, first of all. But also, he may still be charged with genocide and processed for that in the future. But I think if we look at the arc of justice in Latin America and some other parts of the world as well, but especially in Latin America, that these genocidaires and massive human rights violators don't always go to jail for human rights violations because they're not easy violations to prove, and the court processes take forever. The Plan de Sanchez case, we did the exhumation in 1994. It was 2004 when the Inter-American Court ruled in favor of the people of Plan de Sanchez. But that didn't put anybody in jail. It just made the government of Guatemala have to pay Plan de Sanchez. There's still 625 other communities, right? And the people who committed the crimes are still running loose. And if we look at other parts of Latin America, in Chile, when Pinochet died, he was being processed for money laundering. Videla in Argentina, instead of going to jail for killing thousands of people, he was processed for trafficking children. And so I think as long as they're in jail, that is great. And I think he should be tried for genocide, but at least today we know he's off the street and out of power, and we're hoping that there will be someone good in office next year. And really, regardless of who becomes president in Guatemala next year, whoever it is will know that they're not going to be able to get away with the kinds of things that they have in the past. So there's actually, I think, some hope. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you for your attention.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, sorry.
You mentioned Aspen, and I'm actually starting an Aspen club. Yeah, we just started that together.
I don't even know her. And
Yeah.
that's great.
So I was wondering if you had any kind of advice. I mean, I've gone through training with Aspen, so I know the materials and all that, but just kind of from your standpoint. Any thoughts?
Well, yeah, you should get out a piece of paper now that you've introduced yourself as being from Oxfam and ask everyone in here to give you their email if they're interested in either supporting your organization or participating. I'm serious.
Yeah.
That's what you do. And I do that often. I hand out a list where I go and say, will you sign a letter if we're signing, letters? If you're interested in signing a letter, and you start building a base of people that way.
Okay.
That would be the very first thing. Do you have other people who are doing it with you? Or
I have friends supporting me and a faculty advisor and all of Oxfam. I mean, they've been really supportive with providing information and materials.
Well, I really think like the thing to do, well that's good, Sally's got a list out for you going around, is to like everyone see if people are going to sign, and then you send them all an email and they'll tell their friends, and then you meet together, and then you like choose something that's reachable on the campus, You probably can't, stop the war in Syria, but maybe you could help provide vaccines there. Or there was an article in the New York Times I think it was today or yesterday, about a measles outbreak in the DCR, the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Like 400 people have died from measles there. It's terrible. And so, to have something concrete, like that's what works best in your organizing. I think working with students, something concrete that will be of interest to people here on campus. So if you have something specific, instead of it being Oxfam generally, but one of their specific campaigns, maybe helping Syrian refugees in Lebanon or Syrian refugees someplace, or whatever area of the world it is that everybody here is interested in. That might be the thing to do, collectively get together, because unfortunately there are so many crises in the world. You have to kind of choose one that you want to focus on, I think, so that you can feel like you make a difference. That'd be my recommendation, at least.
And make a target, like even Halloween as a first target date for people to contribute for treats, not tricks, on a specific event or topic.
Right. Yeah, that's all. I'm planning it right now. Actually, our like full year-long action plans are due today, and I was actually thinking about focusing more on the Grow campaign and addressing hunger. But there's so much. And I also want to do things that my club members are excited about. So it kind of gets difficult to focus, but
you have to bring everybody into focus, otherwise everyone gets frustrated and goes off on their own, I think, probably. But that's good, you have energy and you're moving a project forward. So, and you've got people signing up with interest here too.
Yeah.
That's great.
I have two questions. One is about the statistics you showed, the peak in 1982 and then the peak kind of towards the kind of the first decade of the 2000s. So you showed that you have kind of broke this down in districts. Did you ever do a comparison between rural and urban areas?
For contemporary homicides?
In comparison to 82?
Yes.
So what was the outcome of that?
Actually, I have it. Oh, it's on a different. I don't have my memory stick in here. Well, the outcome is that if you look at a map, like mapping Guatemala, the central part of the Department of Guatemala, where Guatemala City is, Chimaltenango, which is right next to it, Quiché, Huehuetenango, Baja Verapaz, Alta Verapaz. Those are the highest areas of homicide. For contemporary homicide today, in the past, there were, in the 80s, the rural homicides, with the massacres, and the rural homicides far outpace the urban homicides. But today, the homicide rate, it's an urban phenomenon. But it's not just in Guatemala City, it's in Chiquimula, it's in Huehuetenango, it's in San Marcos. But if you look at a map of Guatemala, what you see is there are corridors, right? They're trafficking corridors. And the reason that those trafficking corridors exist is because the military structures were never completely taken apart. And even if military officials retired, there are certain parts of Guatemala where they really operate like little fiefdoms. And so the army with or former army officials with the drug traffickers and with gang members, there are these formal and informal relationships. I mean, they have relationships of regulations and taxing. that are outside of that of the state, which is why it made so much sense, I think, probably to the Perez Molina administration to just develop their own parallel taxing system and let people evade paying the government tax and pay them a lesser tax, because that's how they function in those corridors. And those are the places where the homicide rates are really high. And impunity is really high because those people commit homicides, because they tolerate homicides, and because the government and the judicial system has allowed those homicides to continue. So if you have a situation where there are agents of the government committing homicides, the police who should be investigating it are looking the other way and tolerating them, and the judicial system is omitting the omission of their responsibility to investigate and prosecute those cases, you end up with a 98% impunity rate on homicides in Guatemala. But the never comparison, it's in the urban areas today as opposed to the past. Oh, he had two.
Can I just follow up on that? Which is, wouldn't you also have to attribute the shift to urban homicide in terms of the massive deportation from the US of men who were sent back to Guatemala and Salvador, and that they would be more likely to resettle in towns and cities rather than in rural regions, and then get involved sometimes with paramilitary, military, but also just in this intra-gang craziness that we already see here in the inner city. I just wondered, is that another factor?
I mean, I think perhaps for El Salvador, and it may also be somewhat in Honduras, and there may be a percentage of that in Guatemala, but generally people go back to the communities from which they came. If you're from San Jose Pinula and you get deported, you don't go to Guatemala City because you don't know anybody there. You go to San Jose Pinula, and if you go to Guatemala City, you go stay with a relative there. But people tend to go back to the communities where they came from because there aren't jobs for people. And I mean, even the issue though it's a really interesting question though, because the gangs are everywhere. They're not just in urban areas. So that's a shift from the past. And the last time I was in Neiba, I actually took a novelist up to Neiba who wanted to interview massacre survivors. So I took her up there, and I was with my Ixil friends, or 3 Ixil women, and I'm very tall, so I always look like someone's put a straw in me and blown me up next to them, right? Because they're like this big, and I'm this giant person next to them. And all of a sudden, they were like surrounding me. I was actually pregnant at the time. They're surrounding me. I'm like, what's going on? And my friend Magdalena says, "Un bardero." And I'm like, oh my God, it looked like a little boy dressed up for Halloween as a gang member, right? Because he was like a 14-year-old. She's like, he has a gun or a knife, you know, because the gangs are in all parts, because the drug trafficking is moving through all parts. So I think it's probably, that may be a factor, but I think it's probably more the drug traffickers. It's interesting.
Yeah, I had another question. You talked a lot about your research and how you approach it and methodological questions there. And then just briefly, in passing, you mentioned that as a result of the research, you kind of become part of the community. And earlier on, so you didn't hear this, we had lunch together, and she mentioned that she had conducted 500 interviews. So I was wondering, I mean, when you become part of the community or of these families, how are you able to manage this to kind of maintain all these relationships? Because it's not just a few; it's a lot over the years and decades.
Yeah.
And you have an enormous responsibility on the one hand. How are you able to handle this?
Well, I think it's a really good question. First, I mean, I think that you become part of the community the minute you set foot in it, whether you mean to or not, right? And when you take a testimony from a survivor, or you interview a survivor, you become part of their own experience with their experience, because you're part of their experience of remembering it. Just like they're part of my experience of understanding it, I'm also part of their experience of understanding how to talk about what happened to them to someone from the outside. So I think you become part of the community then. And I mean, obviously I don't maintain a relationship with 500 people. That's not a possibility. But I do maintain relationships with different people who were sort of like my nodal point in the community. So the person who was my translator, or the leader in the community who asked us to go in and do the exhumation, or asked us to do the testimony, like Maria Makin, or I mean, I don't have regular contact, but I know when there are these days on the Tigo, which is the cell phone system in Guatemala. Guatemala has the highest saturation of cell phones of any country in the Western Hemisphere, which I think is mostly because drug traffickers buy phones and throw them away. But everybody in rural areas also has, like indigenous people up in the mountains, they all have little cell phones too. And so they'll have these days, they'll be like, Sunday, call your relatives in the United States for 5 minutes for free. And I always know when it's one of those Sundays because I'll get a lot of calls from Guatemala, because that's when people will call in. So I think she had a question, and he had a question, and then you. Okay.
You were talking about femicide earlier in the presentation, and that's just a new concept to me. So what would be the reason to specifically target women? Would it be to destroy the reproductive capacity, or would there be other reasons or causes?
That's a really good question, and it's actually the category of femicide or feminicide in contemporary literature about the killing of women. Homicides, most women are killed by people in their intimate circles. So if you're under 18, you're killed, you're most likely to have been killed by your father or older brother, or a stepfather, or your mother's boyfriend. And if you're between the ages of 16 and like 25 or 30, you're most likely to be killed by your boyfriend, your ex-boyfriend, your husband, or your ex-husband. And if you're over 40, you're most likely to be killed by your son. I mean, then it's really kind of shocking, right? Or your stepson. So, and that's kind of true in lots of different countries, not just in Guatemala, but also in the United States, South Africa, Europe, Spain, wherever you look at those numbers. And so feminist theorists who look at the killing of women and try to understand it, they say it's femicide because these women are being killed because they are women. It's because of their condition of being women. Because men are usually killed by someone they know, but not by their partner. Right? They're killed like in a fight. It's like something that was outside of what's supposed to be a safe space, because we're taught to fear the boogeyman on the street, not the person in our personal space, which is where most women are killed. And so feminist theorists called it femicide. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police started to use that category to better understand the MO of how women are killed, to investigate it better, because it's actually different than the way that men are killed. The FBI, it's still debated, I don't know if they're using that term to separate out female killings from male killings, but because the conditions are different, they need to be approached differently. Feminicide is a different category because it holds the state responsible. And Philip Alston, who is the United Nations Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, he's talked about state responsibility for killings, both for social cleansing as well as for the killing of women, that the state is responsible when it omits its responsibility to protect its citizens. So he would say that all of these homicides today in Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador, even if the state didn't actually commit those killings, the state is responsible because it's not holding up to its obligation of what it's supposed to do. And in a place like Guatemala, where you have impunity, it's because the very people who are charged with upholding law are the ones who are violating it, right? That was the case with Perez Molina. And you had a question.
Oh, yes. In your opinion, is the evidence linking the current president, Perez Molina, as to genocide compelling as the evidence that linked Rios Montt to genocide?
Yes, it is, because one of the things, it's a great question, because one of the things that came up in the Rios Montt trial was a witness who was an official in the army, not a foot soldier, a low-ranking official under Perez Molina, and in the course of his testimony in the trial, he named Perez Molina as having given him orders to commit massacres. And so I think the evidence is really strong. And that leaked document, the Operación Sofía, we're pretty darn sure that he's Comandante Tito. So there, when that image that I showed you of Perez Molina when he found out he was going to jail, I saw that floating around in social media with a hashtag that said Tito Frito, right? So, which was, I mean, I'm not going to put that up, but I can tell you that, right? Because it shows how people are putting together the information in the way that people understand it. But I think it is really compelling. And there are other people, I mean, the thing is, like, it's kind of limitless.
Translate this into English.
Fried Tito, yeah. So, thank you. Yeah, and I think it is compelling. And there are others who, you know, who are on, like, not a short list, who also have responsibility. Like, there's a commander, former general, whose name is Kilo Ayuso, and he is the current director of the Guatemalan Army Veterans Association. And he was the commander in Chimaltenango. And so if you look at the high impact areas of massacres and genocide, those people who are commanders in those spaces are the most implicated, especially as having command responsibility. And we know that Kilo Ayuso was involved in writing Operación Surquía. So there's a lot of work to be done, but there are a lot of people committed to justice in Guatemala. So, and you had a question?
Yes, I'm Allison Denton-Town. I teach human rights and international law.
Oh, great. Thanks for being your students.
Well, it's a pleasure to hear you speak. I've admired your scholarship, especially the engaged observer, which we've used in class.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you a couple of things. One was about cell phones, which you mentioned earlier, and I wondered how pervasive they were, but you've already answered that. And I wondered to what extent the use of cell phones and digital cameras and technology was facilitating efforts to document human rights abuses, and we could discuss that a little bit. I also wondered about research ethics and what challenges you might have encountered in your research, you know, as a scholar at a university in this kind of human rights work, because since anthropology is sometimes treated differently from the other social sciences. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about that. And then I just want to say about Philip Alston, he was my professor for economic rights, but I don't think he can take credit for that idea about state responsibility. I think that was Rebecca Cook.
Oh,
who wrote
really?
the cookbook for women's human rights.
Oh.
That I'm sure he said that in his report, but I like women to get credit when they originate an idea. So I think
Absolutely.
I think she's the one who first pointed out that states should be held responsible for failure to act by government.
Oh, that is so fabulous. Thank you so much. That's great. I didn't know that. That is wonderful. Thank you. Well, the using social media is an amazing thing, and that has a lot to do with Perez Molina being in jail. Because the history of these demonstrations, for those of you who don't know, because it really hasn't been in the news here, the demonstrations against, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button here. The demonstrations against Perez Molina, there's a small group of people who put up a note on Facebook. They expected 10 or 20 people to show up in the plaza, and 10,000 people showed up. It went up on Facebook and it just flew through Guatemala. And so social media has been huge in getting information out. And there's Plaza Pública, which is an online newspaper in Guatemala, and there's El Faro, which is an online newspaper in El Salvador. And they've become the alternative press in Central America. So if you want to know what's really happening, you go to those sources. And then you look at the newspapers secondarily, because they still represent the oligarchy for the most part. And then,
sorry,
yeah.
I meant more if the social media, if the technology is being used to document human rights abuses as they're occurring, like at police stations.
No, not at police stations, but it's being used to document human rights abuses in the mining and in the areas in San Marcos and in Huehuetenango, where there are mining interests, because there are about, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, 7 different communities where there are Canadian mining companies that have gotten permission from the Guatemalan government to mine the land, but the indigenous people have rights under the United Nations, and they have had popular votes in their community, and they have virtually unanimously voted, like 90% voted against having these the mining come in and mining their land. But that hasn't stopped the police from coming in. Those things have been documented on social media. The other thing that was documented on sort of mixed in social media was a massacre that happened at Pavon prison. And there are mixed bits of it. Some of it was documented by the Human Rights Ombudsman's office and journalists who were there, but there was also some bits of it that were documented by social media. I haven't seen anything currently in police stations, but I don't know that most of the violence actually happens in police stations in Guatemala today, but that's a question. And then, I mean, I think in the ethics, I can tell you, I really like in the exhumations, it's kind of representative because it's not unique at all. The forensic team, they get threats all the time in Guatemala, as do all the people who do human rights there get threats. And people, internationals who work there, we've all gotten threats too. But in 1994, when we were doing that exhumation, it was the third exhumation in the country. And there were just 5 of us, and we would go up there really early, at like 4 o'clock in the morning. We would drive up there on Monday, and we would stay there until Thursday or Friday and drive back to Guatemala City and do paperwork in the office on the weekend. So it's 1994, it's really before email. Email kind of happened when I was in the Campo sometime in Guatemala. And so we were receiving information by fax, right? That's still when you faxed everything. And we got back to our office, and we had a death threat that had been faxed to us. And it said, dejan los muertos en paz, hijos de puta. Leave the dead in peace, sons of whores. And peace was spelled incorrectly. And that same threat had gone to the Human Rights Ombudsman's office at the national level and also at the regional level. And so we're like, oh, God, what are we going to do? And so we drove up on Monday morning. I mean, the good thing was that the Human Rights Ombudsman was fabulous, Jorge Mario Garcia LaGuardia, and he came up with national and international press that week to support the process. But we drove up on Monday morning with a big debate in the car amongst all of us who were doing the work. And so there were some people who said, well, we can't do this. We have to tell them that we can't do this because it's going to put them in danger. But if we tell them that, then they're not going to want to do it. And then there's going to be no political space, and it will shut down exhumations in the country. And then there are other people who said, well, we can't tell them because if we tell them, then it will shut it down. It was against us, it wasn't against them. And then there were those of us who said, well, actually, we have an obligation. We have to tell them that we received this threat, but we also have to tell them we think there are things that we can do to make it safe to be able to continue doing the exhumation, but ultimately it's the community's decision. Because we were invited here by the community, and they're the ones who are best able to decide what can happen. Well, when we pulled up into this little village of 24 families, it was really quiet, because usually they were all around waiting for us, and it was really quiet. We're like, uh-oh, what happened here? What's going on? Well, what had happened, well, we were getting the postmodern death threat. The commander at the army base called all the men from the villages in Rabinal down to Rabinal. So they'd had to hike down the mountain on Sunday, go stand in the heat at the military base and listen to the commander tell them that all the journalists, all the forensic anthropologists, and all the internationals were all guerrilleros, they were all subversive, and you know what happens when you help the guerrilleros, the violence of the past will return. Dejan los muertos en paz, right? The same thing, leave the dead in peace. And so while we were having our debate driving up, the community was having that same debate. Do we tell the Fordenses? But what if they get scared? If we tell them and they go away, then we have no political space here. And el espacio se va a cerrar, the space will close here. What are we going to do? But they had the same conversation and came to the same conclusion. And so we had a meeting, and they explained to us what had happened, and they told us that they wanted us to still stay there because if we left, then they would be more repressed than before. And then they told us, which was really funny, and you all are risk takers, and you have to be more careful because you don't go back to your hotel after you have dinner at night. You all walk around in Rabinal, and that's not safe. And we're like, how on earth do you know what we do back in Rabinal? And they're like, we have friends. So they had their friends watching us to make sure nothing would happen to us in Rabinal. So I think, ethics cuts all the way around, and the best way is to be honest. So, you had a question?
Yeah, as you know, we have a lot of, we have several other genocides in the Shoah Foundation Institute's Visual History Archive. And when we brought in some of the new testimonies from Guatemala, we were talking about how to describe the historical event in our database in a specific way. Mm-hmm. And there were various dates given for the genocide, and one was, I think, 81 to 83, and then there was a much broader one, which was like 64 to 94. And then I was wondering, is the genocide over? Is there an end date? Is there a beginning date?
Well, it depends if you quantify it. I think probably if you want to start it with when massacres against indigenous people happened in the late 20th century, then the first massacre is in 1979 in Ponsos, in May of 1979 against the villagers of Ponsos. But there were some massive disappearances that happened. So other people will say it started in 1964 with a massive disappearance of union organizers or a massive disappearance of Communist Party members. So it depends on how you define genocide and what phenomenon you're looking at in Guatemala, because it has everything. When you look at the numbers of Guatemala, 200,000 people were killed, right? 626 village massacres, 50,000 people disappeared. That's, like, I don't know, how big is the USC Stadium? It probably holds 50,000 people. Imagine it filled.
93,000.
93,000. Okay, well, then let's imagine a different stadium. Let's imagine the stadium, the Levi Stadium in Santa Clara that holds 50,000 people. Imagine what it's like when you go to an event with 50,000 people. Now imagine it empty. All those people disappeared. Where'd they go? Right? So, I mean, it's kind of stunning. What happened to those people and who were they? The stats on the genocide in Guatemala over the arc of all of the killing, you have 87% indigenous, right? So you have 87% indigenous, 13% Ladino. That 13%, that's still like almost 30,000 people. That's more people than were killed by Pinochet. So how do you define it? And who were the Ladinos who were killed? They were teachers, catechists, lawyers, students, university professors, union organizers, health promoters, anyone who stood up for social justice. If you consider political genocide, or people who belong to political parties, it depends what your definition is going to be. So I think it's really important to think about how how Shoah wants to look at the violence, and if you want to look at it and including mass killings, which is my understanding because of the Nanchang, right? The killings there, which isn't really a genocide, but they're mass killings, then it ends up being in a different category. So, I mean, I would really have to think about it a lot too. If you want to look at the Maya genocide, then in the late 20th century, I would say the intense genocide is 81 to 83, when a decision was made, we're going to just wipe this area out. I think the massacre in 1979 was because they felt like you can do that. The army can just go in and kill a bunch of people. But they didn't plan, I don't think in 1979 they thought we're going to wipe out all these people, at least from the numbers. Because if you map out what's in the Truth Commission report, you can look at all the massacres and the violence that was committed, and you can kind of, it's sort of an answer to your question as well. You can see sort of geographic waves, and those waves also give you an idea of who the victims were. Were they in the city? Were they in rural Guatemala? And so, I don't know, maybe you definitionally separate those two areas so that you have the Maya genocide and mass political killings, or if you follow Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide instead of the UN Convention and say that if you decide that you're going to kill all people who are members of the Communist Party or whoever spoke with someone who was a communist, like they did in Indonesia, we're going to count that as genocide as well, then you have a different definition of it. And you could still separate that and have the Maya genocide in Guatemala, political genocide in Guatemala. I'm not sure, you'd have to think about it. I'd have to think about it to answer it better. It's a great question.
Thank you.
I'm just curious if you see any obvious connection between the genocide and the mass immigration of Central American migrants last summer.
Well, then I think the mass immigration is related to contemporary violence, but contemporary violence is a product of previous violence that was left in impunity. So I think it's tied together, and it's also tied with U.S. policy. Right? What is U.S. policy in Central America? I mean, I don't know. Does anyone know? I don't know that the administration knows. What is U.S. policy in Central America? It's not really clear, and it hasn't been. So, when the countries have just been sort of left in chaos there, largely. But they're fleeing violence, and the asylum claims are valid that people have had, and because you in areas of Guatemala, and it's not just one area or another, but it's in rural areas, urban areas, you can't walk out in the street. And people who so your father comes to work here. This is part of like this massive migration of minors as well. Your father comes to work here, he's working as an undocumented worker somewhere in the United States, sending money home every month to support the family. But the gang members in the area notice that, your mom got a washing machine. So they must have some money. So then your dad gets a phone call, and your mom and maybe you are being held hostage by the gang members. And these are real cases that we've had. And so, they'll do awful things to you so that your father hears you on the phone and and then they'll ask the father, some poor undocumented person who's cleaning pools in New Jersey, we want $50,000 from you. And so in the end, what he's able to gather amongst all his friends in the church and everybody kicking in is a couple $1,000s, and he sends it down and they release you. And so what are you going to do? You're going to stay there? No, because that doesn't eliminate your fear. It lets other people in the area know that your dad will pay money if you get grabbed. And that's what the gangs have been doing. It's a really horrible situation of insecurity that people are living in. So it's that violence that's part of the legacy of the genocide that's created this crisis here. And that's why you see people coming from Honduras and El Salvador as well. It's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you very much.